just before I move on, I just want to do a quick review of tables, which is what we covered last time, and just kind of, what they are. So I'm just going to create a new file here and just call it demo.html. And just create a quick oops, better spell things right. And I'm just going to skip what should be in the head. Don't you do that. And I'm just going to put a table in. I'm not going to put anything else in. So just to kind of keep the code nice and clean so you can see what I'm doing. So a table is a grid of rows and columns. So you would use this for data, for tabular information. So anything that you think you want to put on a web page that kind of naturally goes into rows and columns is probably a candidate for a table, or as the author calls them, web tables. It's the only kind of tables we have in HTML. So we can create this table, and it basically creates a grid structure for us to put our data in. And they work really well, and they're actually pretty simple, except that there's a lot of markup. That's kind of the downside. So there's a lot of markup, and some of the stuff I showed you last class, like column spans and row spans, that gets kind of complicated, but most tables don't have the kind of row spans and column spans that this table does in the tutorial, because the author needed to find an example that would use everything he's showing you. And so it is kind of a natural table for the row spans and column spans. But a lot of tables will have none or very few spans in them. It's not really a common thing, but you do need to be aware of them because they do come up. So we have, in order to create a table, we use the HTML element table, and that will contain the table. Okay? And often we'll give that a class name or an ID name just to be able to identify it, although it's not that important if you only have one table. But that is something that the author did just to give you the idea of how to do that. So it's a good idea to go in here and just give it a class. Oops, I lost my table. And, this could be, I don't know, maybe this is data for a race or something. So we give it some class name that would be useful. Whether you use an ID or a class doesn't really matter. The nice thing about a class name is that you can reuse it on the same page. So if you ended up needing to add another table that was just like the one you just had there, like you wanted it formatted just like the one you already had, which probably you would if it's similar data at least, then you want to be able to give it the same class name so that you don't have to do all that CSS over again, right? You can reuse it on both tables. So class is probably a good idea because if I used ID, my other table could not have the same ID. Okay, IDs have to be unique. Okay, that's the primary difference between a class and an ID. Okay, now within our table is made up of rows. So we have rows across and we have columns vertically, but we don't actually put data into columns, we put data into rows. And then the columns just kind of come intrinsically from the number of cells we put in a row. And we put a row in by using the TR element, table row. And these are abbreviated, most of these like TR, and then we also saw TH and TD. These are abbreviated, which is really nice because you put a lot of them in, so it keeps them fairly short. If they had great big long names like table row, that would be really awful to have to type and even to look at. Tables are bad enough to look at the code for them as it is. So we have a table row, and then inside of the row, we have data and or cells, I guess would be a better word. And those cells can either be heading cells or data cells. So they can either be a heading for a row or a column. So usually they're at the top or the left-hand side of our table. We don't usually have THs. I don't think I've ever had THs in the middle of my table. But sometimes if a table is really long, you might repeat a heading row halfway through or something, just so that when you scroll, you still have headings. But that's just for really big tables. So my first row, for example, I'd put probably all THs if you're going to have headings across the top. And so I might have something like name, and I'm just making this up. This has nothing to do with the tutorial. And maybe time. So this is a race. So I have the and the last one. So I'm just putting some data, and maybe place, like how someone placed. And so that's all I'm going to do. And so if I pop over here, you can see that, and I'll just move this over so that it fits. Now I'm not going to do any CSS. Maybe I should. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to do some CSS, but I'm going to do it in the head just so I don't have to create a separate style sheet. And I know I should put it in a separate CSS file, but I'm just going to do it in a style tag and just put some CSS in there. So I'm going to say table.race, right? So it's the table that has the class race. And I'm going to set the width to 100%. And I'm going to put a border on it. And I'm just putting a black border on it so you can see it. And then within that table, so within table.race, I want to format the THs. And I also want to format the TDs the same way. So I'll just do both. And I forgot my comma. So I need a comma there. So this is combining both into one rule, and I'm just going to put a border 1 pixel solid black on that so that we can see that. And then you can see that my borders are separate. So my cells have a border on them, the table has a border on it, and you can see each of those. And oh, okay. I have a comment that says, I feel like that could be another way to make your links at the top of the website. And yes, that's true, but it's probably not the best way. Tables are a little bit rigid, and we used to do this, actually. We used to use tables for the links across the top of the page. But if you stick to the nav with the UL in it, it gives you a lot more flexibility as far as formatting later on. But that's a really good observation because, yeah, you're kind of seeing what I'm doing here, and it looks like navigation across the top without any CSS, really, right? But yeah, it's not the best way to do it, especially from a semantic point of view, because we want the markup to describe the content, and a table doesn't really describe your nav. Now you could put the table in a nav. That would, if you put it in a nav, that would say, okay, these are the navigation links. But the UL actually is more flexible. Okay, so you can see that each of them has their border. So each cell has a border, and the table has the border, and that can get kind of ugly as we go on, having all these double borders. And so we have the option that most people just put in right away, and that is to collapse the borders. And the property is is border collapse. And the default value is separate. You can see the borders are separate, or the option is collapse. Okay. And sometimes when you see CSS properties like this, you wonder, why didn't they just make this the default instead of separate? And it's just historical because the tables, before there was CSS, tables had separate borders. And so when CSS came along, they had to make the default what was already happening in the system. Okay, so that's kind of why some defaults aren't what you would wish they were, but you can just set them, and then you're all set. Okay, so now you can see we just have one border. The borders are actually on top of each other, so it basically creates a single border between cells instead of separate borders. Okay, now I'm going to add another row, and so each row needs its own TR, and inside of a TR, the only child elements we can have are THs and TDs. Okay, now in this case, I'm not going to have a TH at the beginning of my row because I just need the headers across the top, name, time, place. I'm not going to have anything down the left-hand side. So I'll just have all TDs. Okay, so that's a little different than the one we saw in the schedule. And then maybe I'm in this race, and say it's a 5K run or something. And so TD, so the time, I'm not very fast, so it would be about like 35 minutes and some odd seconds. And then we'd have the place. I'd probably come in last place if anybody who could run was running with me. And so then we get that data in there, okay? So I'm not going to go any further with this example because we did cover it, and you can always review the video. But this is the idea of a table. We have a table, and then we have rows, and inside of the rows we have cells, data cells, either headings, THs, or data, TD. Okay, and we did also see last time that we can add a caption that can go inside the table. There's very few elements that can be direct children of the table element. Rows is the main one. Okay, your table will mostly contain rows. We also saw a caption, and then today we're going to see row and column groups, which can also go inside the table. But you can't just put a heading like an H1 inside of a table, or inside a TR for that matter. But inside of THs and TDs, you can put anything. Yeah, anything, really. You know, anything that could go in the body, you can put inside of a TH or a TD. It's pretty crazy what you can put in there. So you could put images, you could put an article with a whole bunch of content in it. And so you do whatever you need to do. Like, don't just go crazy. Do what's appropriate. But the THs and TDs can have any element inside of them. Okay, whereas table has just a few, and TR only has THs and TDs that can be direct children of it. Okay, are there any questions about that? Could you explain the way to create and use attributes? Oh, okay, that's kind of going back to the first tutorial. So an attribute is this, right? This class is an attribute, okay? And some elements have specific attributes that go with them. Like we saw with the A element, the link, it has an href that goes in it to make it a link. And so there are some attributes that are specific to some elements. And then there are what are known as, oops, you mean the data attribute. Oh, okay. Well, that kind of follows on this. So the data attributes are attributes that you can make up yourself. So what I was going to say, let me just finish that thought. Class and ID are what are known as generic attributes because they can go on any element. Okay, they're generic because they can go anywhere. So you can put a class attribute or an ID attribute anywhere. Data attributes are also generic. And I assume the reason you're asking is because in the second homework assignment, case 2, well, the modified case 2 that I gave you, you're going to use some data attributes in it. And what he had you do was in the cell, he asks you to add a data date attribute. So it's data-date equals, and then you put a date in there. And he just had you put it in kind of normal format. So today is November 18th, 2020. And so you can put in a data date attribute. Now these data attributes, you can make them up. So in this case, the author made it up and told you to use it, but you can make them up. So what was happening was people were making up their own attributes, but there was no real system for doing it because sometimes it's handy to be able to hide some data in your HTML markup. And you'll see how this works. He's going to use it for styling in that assignment. He also uses it in the book version of the assignment. He uses it for the mobile version, but in the PDF that I give you, I took that out. I took the mobile version out, but he does use them for styling even in the version that I gave you. So you do have to include them. So just a reminder for case 2, follow my instructions, the PDF, not the book instructions, because it's like half as much work, okay? And most of the stuff that I took out, you won't know how to do. You'll have to go back to the chapters we skipped. Okay, so we covered this data attribute early on. So what they did is they said, okay, let's make a way for people to be able to make their own attributes that won't conflict. because it would be a problem if I made an attribute name and then later when they were developing HTML, they said, okay, we want to invent this attribute called this, but oh, look, people are already using it on the web. They've made up their own. So what they did is they said, if you make up your own data, your own attributes, just start them with data dash, and then whatever you put after that, you can put whatever you want. You can call it whatever you want as long as it starts with data dash, and that will be legal. Okay, so that's what that is. It's just a made up attribute that the author is going to use, and then he's going to use CSS to use the attribute selector. So you'll have to go back to chapter 2, tutorial 2, to see how to do an attribute selector to select the month. Okay, that's what he does. He has you select the month. I think the calendar is for September, and there's a little bit of August at the beginning and a little bit of October at the end. And so he styles all of them that have a data date attribute that contains capital SEP in order to style it. Okay, so that's all that a data attribute is just a made up attribute. Okay, I hope that answers your question. If not, get back to me after class or maybe private chat just to clear it up. But that probably did help a lot of people because that is in the assignment. So, and I thought that was kind of cool. When I saw that, I thought, oh, that's kind of a cool use for that, especially if you did the mobile part of it. Don't do the mobile part though, but yeah, he does use it. So, so it's kind of a neat example of how you can use it. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to go away from this now and back to our project and carry on. So we're doing this this one, and just shrink this side down a bit. And I'm going to pick up with the slides now, and see where we are. Where are my slides? Here we go. Okay. So what we're going to look at now is row and column groups. Now, the first thing we'll look at is row groups. And what you've seen is we have a bunch of TR elements, and they're not really grouped in any way. They're just a bunch of rows, row, 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 row. Well, we can group these by putting another element around them to kind of make a group of rows, all right? And there are 3 row group elements that we can use: T-head, T-foot, and T-body, okay? And these are for marking up header cells for our table, which are the ones that go across the top, footer cells for our table, which go across the bottom, and body cells for our table, okay? Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that these are not required, so you don't have to put them in your code. So for example, in this table is perfectly legal, and there are no T-head, T-foot, or T-body elements to group the rows. We just have row, 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 okay? But if I go into Chrome or any browser and go inspect element, and I want to see the HTML, why is it showing styles? Oh, okay, I want to click on elements. What's going on? Oh, this is just really big, I think. There we go. Okay, that's what I wanted to see, is the browser's version of what we're doing, okay? So this looks like our HTML, but it's not. It's the browser's memory model of our page, basically. And in this developer tools, it's represented as HTML so that we can understand what we're looking at. So it works really well. It gives us a way to look inside the browser at what the browser's doing. So if I take a look here, and if I can find my table, and see all these data brackets IDs, those are from brackets so that it puts its hooks into Chrome so that it can do the live reload and highlighting and all that. So ignore those because they're not in my HTML. Brackets is inserting those as it goes. So what I want to do is find my table. It should have opened. Oh, what I can do is just do that, select inspect right on my table, and then it'll open up my table. Okay, now there's my table, right? And there's my rows, but you'll notice there's a T-body, okay? And that is the element for a table body. We're going to put one in a minute, but there isn't one in my table. So why do I see one here? And this can be a bit of a stumbling point when you're doing anything with a table with CSS or later with JavaScript, when you learn JavaScript next semester. You can interact with tables, and of course we've seen CSS. So if you said table direct child greater than TR, that wouldn't work, even though in our HTML, the TR is a direct child of the table, all right? It always puts a T body in. So the browser basically, if you make a mistake in your HTML, the browser will fix it for you, okay? So for example, if I left off my closing paragraph tag here on line 48, the browser would see that now I have a table and it would say, oh, well, you can't have a table inside a paragraph, so that paragraph must be closed. And it would insert that closing paragraph tag for you, basically fixing your mistake. Now, this is a case where it's not a mistake because the T-body is optional, but it does insert it. It always inserts it. So your tables will always have a T-body even if you don't put it in, okay? And that's the thing you have to remember. If you don't put it in, I've just kind of gotten in the habit of always putting these row groups in, just then I don't have to worry about it, right? This is the only time that I know of where the browser basically fixes something that isn't broken, okay? Because that T-body is optional in your HTML, but the browser does always insert it. Okay, it creates a level of consistency at least, but you have to be aware of that. Okay, and all browsers do that. Okay, so it's not just something Chrome is doing, all browsers do it. So it must be in the specification. I don't read those because those are for people that build browsers, but that's kind of an odd one because I haven't come across that anywhere else in HTML other than fixing things that you've left off that by mistake or something. Okay, so that's, I just wanted to show you that because that is important. And now let's slide that over, and I'm going to try to make my screen so that you can see both sides. Okay, now I mentioned here in the slide that we have these three elements, T-head, T-foot, T-body. They're all optional. You don't have to have, like if you use one, you don't have to use the others. So for example, T-foot, we often don't have a row that is a footer row. That would be a row that's separate from your data, right? It wouldn't have data in it. So often our tables don't have a T-foot. And you just saw that the one that I'm using now, it has a T-body by default. I didn't put it in, but it's there. And no T-head or T-foot, okay? So T-body is required, I guess. So if you put a T-head in, you should put a T-body in. But if you don't, the rest of the rows will just go into that T-body. Okay, and so T-head and T-foot are optional. You don't have to have them. Okay, now sometimes your table will be fairly complicated and have more than one row of headers, and you'll see that in the first assignment in case 1, where you have 2 rows that make up the header rows of the table. And so you can group those in a T-head. In this case, we only have 1, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to insert a T-head element. And then brackets is nice enough to put my closing tag there where I don't want it. And I'm going to close it after the that row. So I'm just going to indent this. Okay, so now inside of my table, I have a T-head, and inside of that, I have a TR, which is just a single row, which is my header cells. And what did I do? My header row disappeared. I'm just going to hit refresh here because I've noticed lately, yeah, now it's back. I've noticed lately that brackets, the live preview gets kind of messed up. That didn't used to happen. I've had it duplicate the page, things like that. So just be aware of that. If the page looks just wrong, just hit the refresh, and the live reload seems to continue to work after that. But yeah, that kind of messed up for some reason. Okay, probably when I had one T-head and not the other or something. And then I'm going to put a T-body for the rest of my table. And I'll just put all the rest, whoops, that's too far, all the rest of the rows, and I'll just indent those over and put my closing tag in. Okay, so now all the rest of the rows are in the T body, and again, my thing got confused by me not having a closing tag. Okay, so I just refreshed again. All right, so there's my T body. So that's our T head and our T body. And I just want to kind of flip through the book because I think he adds a T foot. Yeah. So he's going to add another row just to put a T foot in there so that you can see how that's used. The T foot goes at the end. So they have to be in this order: T head, T body, T foot. You can have more than one T body, but you can only have one T head and one T foot. Okay. And so you may want to like split your table into multiple groups, and you can do that with T body, T body, T body. But you can only have one T head, one T foot. The head has to be the first group, and the T foot has to be the last group. Okay, so inside my T foot, because it's a row group, I need to have a row. And then we're going to put in a, let's see, TD. And he's going to just call span this across all of them. So I'll just put this in here right now. Call span equals 8. And by the way, even though this is a number, it goes in quotes. Okay, so even if an attribute is a number, it goes in quotes because technically attributes are always strings. If the browser then converts that to a number, that's fine. But you don't have to worry about, like in your programming course where you have to quote strings and not quote numbers. In attributes, you always quote the value, okay? Because it's just a value. It's not a string or a number as far as HTML is concerned. Okay, so then I've got my table row, and then the content is DLR, and it's broadcast day at 10:30 p.m. Okay, and so you can see that going in there at the bottom. Now, right now, nothing looks different with these, with the T head, T body, T foot. Nothing looks different. The only really point of these is to be able to group our rows for CSS. Okay. The other benefit is that if we have a table that's so big that it spans across multiple pages when we print it out, the browser could print the head and foot on each page, like repeat it on each page. I don't know if browsers do that. They didn't used to. I should check and see, but they theoretically could. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of them. Okay. One weird thing is that from HTML4 to HTML5, they changed something, and that is that the T foot used to have to go right after the T head, okay, and then the T body. And in HTML5, they changed it to go to the bottom of the table, which is kind of where it makes sense. So just if you see code that has the foot, like goes T head, T foot, T body, just know that that's because it was programmed in older HTML4 rather than in HTML5. So they actually changed it, which is kind of a strange thing to do. It kind of can catch you off guard, but it makes more sense when you're coding to put the foot at the bottom. So that's good. All right. So that's that is row groups. And so let's do a little styling with them so we can see what we can do with them, why we would even want them. Now, you'll notice that semantically they make sense, right? Because the T head contains the header row and the T foot contains a footer row. There's no programs in there. It's just a little footer comment. And then the body contains the actual body data. So semantically they make sense, but then we can use them for CSS as well. Okay, so I will just open the CSS. And down here we have row group styles. I'm just going to put some blank lines at the bottom. Oops, geez. Just to move it up the screen a little bit, so it might be easier for you to see. And then in here, I'm going to add a rule for the T head. And I'm going to keep the same pattern of using the table.schedule just to make sure it only selects that table. In case we add another table, we don't necessarily want it styled the same way. And then the T head. So the T head that's in the table with the class schedule. Remember, you don't have to name every element in the hierarchy. So the T head is right inside the table, but you don't have to name all of the descendants with a space there. With the greater than you do, but with the space, you just can have something in there. So up here, where I see, say, TD and TH, of course, those TDs and THs are inside of a TR, which is a row, and that row is now inside of a row group, a T foot, a T head, or a T body. Okay, so I want to put some styling in here, and so I'm going to set the background color. And I think I mentioned this the other day that the author tends to just use background as a shortcut for background color, which works fine as long as you haven't set any other background properties prior to that. Okay, so we set a background, and now you can see it's gone to that purple color. And then we want to set the color to white. So the font color, which is just color, or the foreground color, it's just color. Okay, don't be confused by that in the assignments when the author says set the text color or font color. It's just color. There is no font color, right? It's just color. Okay, so now you see our headings are in white on a purple background. And then we can do the same thing for the T foot. And he uses different colors just so I can't copy and paste very efficiently. So I'll do table, schedule, T foot. And we'll set the background color to black and the foreground color or color to white. And now you can see that that footer row is white text on black background. Okay, so that way I can identify those header and footer cells or rows, whatever, independently of the other cells. Okay, so that is quite nice feature. Okay. Now that's table rows, and they're fairly straightforward because you just put your rows inside of a group element, and so you can group rows with these three elements: T head, T foot, T body. Remember, they are optional, so if you have no need for them, you don't need to put them in. I tend to just always put a T body in, even if I don't have header row. And often you do have a header row, so then I just put in a T head and a T body. Very seldom do I have a footer row. So just so you know, that one is rarely used, but you know, the good example here where he put it in just to put a little comment at the bottom of the table. Okay, now the next item is, oh sorry, I'll just skip over these slides because that's what I did there. Is creating column groups. Now column groups are a little bit abstract because you'll see in our table, we don't have any columns, right? Everything is built by rows, and inside the rows are cells, and the number of cells in each row determines how many columns we have. There's nothing in our table called a column. So we don't have any data that is technically in a column. So these column groups are a little bit abstract. And so we have this element called col group, C-O-L group, and we put that at the top of our table right after our caption, if we have a caption, okay? So there is an order to things, and it goes right at the top, but the caption goes first, and then the column group goes next, and then row groups or rows go after that. Okay, so you have to follow that order. Now, the column group is a way of grouping columns, and so inside the column group, you can define columns. So this is kind of what it looks like. So inside the table, we have a col group element. This one doesn't have a caption, so that's why it's right at the top. And then inside of the col group, we have columns. Okay, so there's an open and close tag for the col group, and then inside of that, we put columns. Now, how do we define columns? Okay, we have another element called col, C-O-L, which defines columns, and it has an optional attribute called span, which says how many columns this column will span. Okay, so we can have one column that represents multiple columns in our table. Now this is a little bit different because these column spans, or if we span a column, it actually kind of represents multiple columns rather than stretching out like our cells do if we do a row span or a col span. And note that this is just span. It's not col span, okay, even though we are spanning across multiple columns. It's just span because that's the only direction you can go. Okay, 1 is the default. So by default, if we don't have a span attribute, this col just represents one column. Okay, so that's what it says down here. Okay. And then within those, we can use IDs or classes if we want to identify columns. So the author is going to do that here. So we'll see an example of that. And I'll come back to this one in just a second. So let's add this. So I'll go back to my HTML. And here's the top of my table, right? There's my caption, which is optional, but I have one. So if you have a caption, you need to put your call group after that. You can only have one call group in your table, but the call group can contain multiple call elements. So in here, I'll put an element for call, and it's an empty element. It has no closing tag because in our table, columns can't actually contain any content. Okay, they're just kind of an abstract representation of our columns. They're very handy because they let us do some CSS on our columns, but they don't actually contain data. And I'll get back to that in just one second. So this is an empty element, right? Now I have 8 columns, so I could put in 8 call elements, but really all I have is I have one column for my times, and then I've got 7 columns for the days of the week. So because those are all the same, I can just span them, okay? But just before I do that, just let me put another one in there. Okay, so this column represents the first column. This one represents the second column. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to give the first one an ID equal to first call. Okay, so that's our first column. And then the second column, we're going to give a class equal to day calls. Okay, this is a little weird, and I'll kind of explain the author's thinking in a minute. Now, we have 8 columns, so I could take the second column and repeat it 7 times, right? Just copy and paste. And now I've got a column, the first column, which has the ID first column, and then I have 7 more columns that each have the class day calls. So I could style the first column one way and then the other columns another way using the class and ID names. Okay. Now, one thing I will mention is I think it's a little awkward that the author used an ID for the first one and a class for the second one. I wouldn't do that. I would just use class for both of them. I think he just wanted to give you some practice with classes and IDs, but you might kind of trip over that when you're doing your code. Make sure you realize that the first one's an ID and the second one is a class, okay? There's nothing wrong with what the author did. I just find that it's a source of possible confusion later on. Okay, now rather than repeat this all 7 times, what I can do is go in here and say span, and it doesn't matter what order you put attributes in, but I'm going to put the span at the front because I feel like it's more important. When I'm looking at the code, I want to know that that is spanned before rather than what class it is. Okay, it doesn't really matter. You could put the span after. The order of attributes never matters. Okay, so that's fine. So now what that basically is, it's like a repeat. So it's like it's repeating 7 times. This call element represents those 7 columns. Okay. Remember, these are empty elements, hence the slash at the end. I can't have any content inside those columns. Okay. Now, that's what this next slide is basically addressing. columns are very limited in what we can do with CSS. For example, if we wanted to change the color of the text in a column, we can't do it using the column because there is no content inside of the column, and setting the color on the column would inherit, but there's nothing to inherit to because there's no content. If we set the color on a row or a row group, where that the cell is actually inheriting that color property from that row group element, okay? But we can use some properties, and these are the properties that we can use, and it's a little bit weird which ones they are, but this is the way they work. In older versions of IE, IE would let you style things that you technically shouldn't be able to, which again was a nice feature, you know, but it wasn't the right feature. It's kind of IE again trying to be better than the others, but not following standards. So anyway, these properties you can set. So you can set column borders, which will give you borders for your column. You can set the background, set a color or an image on the background. We didn't cover images. That was covered in one of the chapters we just skipped. But you can set background properties. The width of the column. And if I set the width on a column that's spanned, it sets the width of each column, not the spanned collection. Okay, and that's something that, again, you just have to know because you may wonder about that when you're kind of are first looking at it. You know, what's the width? Is it the width of all 7 spanned columns, or is it the width of one column? It is the width of one column. And then visibility, which is kind of an odd one. Visibility is a property that I didn't cover, but you will come across it, and often students will find it when they want to hide an element, because you can set visibility to hidden and it will hide elements. But usually what you want is display none, because display none actually makes the element as if it's removed from the code, whereas visibility hidden just makes it not visible. Okay, but we didn't really cover visibility, so I'm not going to worry about it. So the first 3 are really the ones you want: the column borders, the background color, and the width. Okay. So now let's we've already created this. This is all we have to do, okay? There's not a lot of HTML to columns, but it is a little bit, maybe a little bit to get your mind around or to understand, because these columns aren't really in the table. They're just kind of saying, they're defining the columns, I guess you could say, rather than containing content. Okay, so we're defining columns in our table. We're not putting content in our columns. We cannot put content in columns. All right, so we'll go back to our CSS, and down here there's a section for column group styles, and so I want to do a little bit of CSS there. And so what I'm going to do is just set a background color on each of those. So I'm going to say call number sign, because it's an ID, first call. Remember, the first column had an ID of first call, whereas the second column is a class of day calls. Okay, so that's important. And then I'm going to set a background of RGB 218, 210, 218. And now you can see that the color of that column now has that almost gray. It's just an off gray color, a little on the purpley side. If these numbers were all the same, it would be gray, but the green is just a little bit lower, making it a little purpler. I don't know if that's a word, purpler, but more purple. And so that's that column. Now you'll notice that the header row still has its color, and the footer row still has its color. Okay, and you can think of these as layering on top of each other. So first we have our table, then we have our call group, then we have our calls, okay, and then we have our row groups, then our rows, and then our cells. And if you think of them as stacked up like that, you can see why the column color, why the row group color overrides the column group color, because it's in front of it. So we don't see the column color through it. And if we set the color on a cell, it would always win because it's right up front, if you think of it in layers, okay? So that's the first call. And then the others are call dot, because it's a class, day calls. And we're going to set a background color on that. And RGB 255, 220, 255. Okay, and so that gets that fuchsia or light purple color on the background there. Okay. You know, I don't think the table looks that great, but the author's trying to do a lot to make it sort of more visible to you. Okay. And in the book, there's a diagram that shows those layers on the table, the table at the back, and then the column groups, columns, row groups, rows, and the cells. So if you have the book, that's on page 485. It's just a diagram showing those layers to show you the order. And so that if you set the color of one thing, it'll hide the color of whatever is behind it. Okay. Now, we also want to set some widths on these because you'll notice that our rows and columns are not very consistent. I think our rows are fairly consistent. If I make this wider, they won't be, I think. Yeah, so there, if I go to that point, you can see that the half-hour time slots, all of a sudden 10 p.m. gets bigger, and that's because 10 p.m. is a little bit longer, and so it wraps onto two lines. And so we end up with a big fat half hour, whereas the others are the same. And so what we'd like to do is have all the rows the same height and all the columns the same width. You'll see like Tuesday, radio U, it's not very wide, so it's a skinnier row, whereas like this last one, Sunday, is really wide. And you know, Sunday doesn't last any longer than Tuesday, so we'd like to have all those columns the same width. So what we can do is in the in the first column, we can set our widths first. So we can set the width of the first column, and we just use the width property, same width property we used before. And we're going to set that to 16%, okay? And then for the other ones here, now this is the width for each column, not the the span together, it's just each one. And so we're going to make that 12%. And if you do the arithmetic, that adds up to 100%, 12 times 7 plus 16. And so with percent, you want to be careful of that. So you can see now the width of each one is the same, okay? And yeah, so now let's go back to our column row groups here and style the rows to be the same height. Now, we can't really use the we can't set the size on the row group because the row group is an actual element in the table, and it would set the height of the row group, not the height of each row in the group. Okay, so that's important. So we'll have to make another rule for this. So what we're going to do is make one for the TR that's in the T head. So I'll say table.schedule T head TR. Okay, so that's to get the TR that's inside of the T head, and then just to make sure it's in this table, I put this. I don't really need this, but it just specifies that table. And then I'm going to set the height to 30 pixels. So you may have noticed that jump a little bit. It got a little bit taller. That's just the first row, the header row, right? There's only one row in there, but that TR, it's only styling that TR that's in the T head, not any other rows. So then we'll do the TRs that are in the T body. So I'll say table.schedule space T body TR and set a height of 40 pixels. And now you can see it really jump out. And now you can see that the rows and groups are all, sorry, the rows and columns are all nice and equal, right? That first time column is 12, and then the others are 14, I think, or 16. Okay, yeah, the first one, it's a little bit wider, right? 16%, and then each day is 12%. And that the TR that's in the head, the T head, is 30 pixels, and then the half-hour time slots are 40 pixels. We didn't set the TR that's in the T foot. We could if we wanted to, just doing the same way, but the author's happy with it, just using the default. Okay. Now I'm going to take a break now. It's 10 to 12, so let's take a break. And if you have any questions, ask as soon as I come back. And so get up and walk around, get the blood flowing, get your eyes focused on something further away than your screen. And I'll be back at 12 o'clock. Okay, we'll start again in a minute. Just let people get back to their computers. Okay, so just back to the slides here for a minute, just to just trying to get, okay. So this just kind of shows what we've already done in code. So that's in the slides, setting some CSS, and then some properties that we can set. So we looked at, oh, this is about the precedence of if you set background colors or other properties, which one is in front. So here the table, which is the last one in the list, is at the bottom, and then the others stack up on top of it. So table cells are on top. So if you were to set a background color, for example, on all of these, the one you would see is table cells. And in this case, like rows would win over columns, for example. So if you set a color on rows and columns, that would be the row color. You'd see where they intersect. Okay. And we looked at setting some widths and heights there. So we can set widths and heights. Just make sure you set them on appropriate properties, columns or rows. Don't try to set widths and, or sorry, heights on column groups. You can't really do it. Those don't really have a height, and column groups and row groups don't really have heights and widths. They just kind of go around the elements that they're contained in. I don't really know what would happen if you tried to set those. So set the heights and widths on the rows and the columns. You can use the column groups or the row groups anyway to select your rows, and then columns you can give them a class or an ID to identify them. Okay. And this just talks a little bit about the default. So by default, the height of each row is based on the height of its tallest cell. So the grid, you know, it keeps the grid lines straight, but the tallest row, the tallest cell will cause the height of that row to be set. And then with columns, the widest cell will set the width of that column. But we can set those widths and heights in order to control that. And often we don't want to just go with the default and have oddly sized rows and columns. We want them to be consistent usually. Okay. Now there's a property called vertical align, which can be used within table cells. It really only applies to a table cell, to THs and TDs. And it sets the vertical alignment of the content in it. And often we wish that this property worked on other things, but it doesn't. I seem to remember the author using it in one of the previous tutorials, but he had to set the style of the element to be a table cell in order for the vertical alignment to work, which is a bit of a hack. It would be nice if this property did just work more broadly, but really it only works in TDs and THs. So remember that, but it is useful in TDs and THs. And so let's set that on our cells. So if we go back here, looking for where we set the borders, way up at the top. Okay, so table cell styles. So we set a border on the TDs and the THs, so we combine that rule. And then what we want to do is set the vertical align to make it go to the top. Right now, you'll see the default is to center it vertically. So all of our show times are centered in the cell, but really it makes more sense to put them at the top so that they're at the start time, right? So if the show starts at 8 p.m., we want it next to 8 p.m., not down in between 8:30 and 9 or something, wherever it is. So For example, yeah, this one, the classic music connection's way down here, whereas really we'd like to have it up next to 8 o'clock. And same with the others, these two, instead of having them in the middle. So we can use that vertical align property. So here in this, this rule that's applying to both the TDs and the THs on our table, all of the TDs and THs, we're going to use vertical align. And there's a whole bunch of choices for this, but top, bottom, middle is usually the ones you use. So I'll just set it to top. And you see everything pops up to the top. So that's kind of nice. The default is middle, okay? If I wanted, I could put them at the bottom, and they all go to the bottom. And then middle is the default. So we'll put them at the top. Okay, and then while we're here, you'll notice that these words are a little bit crowded up against the borders. So we're going to add some padding. Table cells, TDs and THs, have padding. They do not have margin. Remember, margin is on the outside of the border, and on the outside of the border is another cell. So there is no margin on TDs and THs, but there is padding. So inside of the border, we can set some spacing to just kind of give those words a little room to breathe. And so the author sets 5 pixels on those. And so now you can see it just gives a little space. And if I do just a single value, remember that that applies to the top, right, bottom, and left, right? It's a shortcut for setting all 4 padding sides. So it puts padding all the way around it. So if I only wanted padding on the top, I could use the padding dash top property, or I could even set 4 values for independently setting all 4 sides if I wanted, okay? But I'm just going to set 5 pixels all the way around. Okay, now there is a section in the chapter that I left out. I actually deleted the slides for those, and that was applying table styles to other page elements. And there's actually, remember the display property, which we used before, where we can say display block or display inline or display none. Those are kind of the common values that we would set. But tables, actually, every element of a table has its own special display property. So for example, the table has a display table property is its default. It's not a block element, it's a table, display table. And then like rows are table dash row. So there's a chart there, a table actually, on page 490 that shows all the different display properties that apply by default to tables. And you can use these on other elements, or you can change them on a table to make your table display differently. And the author does talk about that a little bit when he talks about responsive design for tables, but we're going to skip that because we skipped the chapter on mobile, which is the tutorial 5. So we skipped the chapter on how to make your stuff look good on a small screen. And that's really ties into how to make tables look good on a small screen. So you might want to study that on your own if you are interested in doing web development, but I'm going to skip it so you won't be tested on it. Actually, there might be quiz questions. I should have thought of that. Darn it. Yes, there might be some quiz questions, but it won't be on assignments or on your final project. Okay, so that actually finishes tables. That's the end of tables. But we do have one other topic in this chapter, which is unrelated to tables. Okay, it's just here just because it fits, and there's no better place to put it. And it's a feature that I was very excited about when it was introduced in CSS, but then I never use it. It's kind of funny because I thought, oh, this is great. This is so beautiful. And then I never really have the need to use it. So it's kind of a funny thing that way. Sometimes we want things and then we don't really, turns out we didn't really want them after all. And I don't know that I've really ever seen it on a site, but I might have seen it and not really even noticed it. And this is what's known as column layout. And this is like in a newspaper or a magazine where an article will be written in narrow columns, like newspapers especially are famous for this, right? They have very narrow columns. And the reason that newspapers especially have such narrow columns is because they can have a very small line height with narrow columns. Okay, the wider your text is, the greater your line height should be to make it readable. Okay, it's hard to read really long lines of text that are very tight together. If you have long lines, you should increase the line height. Well, what does that do? It wastes paper, right? So if you have a newspaper, you waste a lot of paper increasing the line height. So what's easier to do is decrease the length of the lines. So that's why newspapers have very narrow columns and they have a very small line height, a very short line height. We can do this on the web. And the reason it's not easy to do without special features is that one column will go down and then continue in the next column. So we have this text that's wrapping, and if we add another paragraph in the middle, it would cause the whole thing to flow. And because we don't really know how wide the browser is that the person's using, we can't really create columns by just hard breaking, and putting it into a grid next to each other or something, because we want that flow between columns. So that's what column layout is for. Okay, so we are going to open a different page. The author has given us another page to try this on. So I'll just save those and let's see. LW414, LW0414, that's the page we want. And I'll just double click that and close these others. And then the CSS we're going to use for this is columns.css, and you'll see it's empty right now. So this page is the page we're going to be dealing with. And so this is an article on the radio station's website talking about self-driving cars, and it's quite a long article. And so what we're going to do is break this into columns like in a newspaper, and you'll see how this is really quite cool. And so in here, we need to link this in. So in my HTML, yes, I need to add another link element in the HTML. And so the href equals DLR columns, and the rel equals style sheet. And that's all we need to do there. And then we can go to the CSS, put your name and date in there. And in the column styles, what we want to do is add some columns. So let's just go back to the presentation and have a look at this. Okay, so column layout. So I described what columns are, where we can have text side by side in columns, and it will flow from one to another. Okay, and so this talks about, using float or flexbox. We didn't cover flexbox, but we did cover float. It's different than column layout because if you use these other float or flexbox or grid even, we're dealing with separate elements, and so text can't flow from one element into another element. So we need a single element that can have it flow within columns. So what we're going to do is take a single element and have columns within that element, okay? And the flow will kind of go automatically, okay? So what we can do is we can set up some properties for these columns. And we can do this, we can set the number of columns in two different ways. The easiest is to set the column count. So we set the column count property and we set that to a number, and that will set the number of columns on our page. The other way we can do it is set the column width, and then however many columns fit will be the width. And you'll do that in the one of the assignments. And so you'll see how the number of columns changes depending on the width of it. But in this one, he's going to use the column count to set that. Okay. Now, I'm just going to show you this. Now, this code, this first line, the @media, that is from tutorial 5. So that was covered in the mobile section. And this, basically, I'm going to just type this in. You could just leave it out, actually, because we're not doing a mobile version for the site. Maybe I'll just leave it out. But I'll just tell you that the @media rule is used to control your CSS so that it only this CSS will only apply under certain conditions, like the screen width, for example. Like the min width there means that the width has to be at least 641 pixels for this to apply. So if you go to a smaller phone or a smaller screen, like a phone, you won't get columns, which would be really hard to read, right, on a phone. I'm going to leave the @media rule out because we didn't cover that. For assignment 2, we don't need media in the min width. Right, no, you don't. Use my instructions for case 2, don't use the books, okay? Because the book does tell you to put in an @media rule, and my instructions tell you not to, don't tell you to put it in, okay? So you don't need to put it in, yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that @media rule out. If you're curious about them, you can go back to tutorial 5 and read about it. But I know you've got lots of other things to take up your time, right? A few other courses going on. So leaving the @media rule out, I'm only going to put in the rule for article, and in there I'm going to set column count to 2. And as soon as I did that, you can see in the background, that article went into 2 columns. And the first column actually goes all the way down to the bottom of the screen, and then it continues back up at the top. Now you can see how this isn't really very useful on the web, because it means you have to scroll twice, right? You have to scroll all the way down and then back up and then down the other way. And on the web, we're not paying for paper. So you can make a line height higher and the page can be longer, and it doesn't affect the cost or even the size of the page that's being downloaded. The code is still the same size. So, this has very limited use. The one in the case problem that you do is actually more useful. I forget which one it is, but it's a smaller block of text that you put into columns. Okay, but this puts it into columns. Now, we're not done because there's other properties that go along with columns. They didn't leave it at just having column count. I did mention that you can also use column width to set the width of the column, in which case you would leave out column count, and it would be automatic. It would set the width depending on, let me just try that. I'll just finish that with my semicolon and then comment it out. And I will set column width, and I'll set that to maybe 300 pixels. Maybe that's a little wider than I want. What I want to do is show you that when I go wider, see, now it's gone to 3 columns. So it sets, actually looks like a max width, doesn't it? So it's setting the width so that when you go narrower, it just goes to 1 column, which is fine for a phone, right? So if you use column width, it would give you your phone view right away. And then if I go wide enough, it goes into 2 columns. If I'm wider, it goes to 3 columns, of course. Now, of course, your user doesn't sit there making the screen wider and narrower, right? It'll just load up whatever width they have. So they won't really be aware of it changing because it won't change for them. They'll just get what they get. If they have it wide, they'll get more columns. Okay, so just you'll be using this on the assignment instead of column count. So you can use one or the other. I don't know what would happen if you did both, because they would kind of conflict with each other. Okay, so I set it back to column count 2, and now the columns get wider as the page gets wider, but I still just have 2 columns, right? Okay. Now, another thing we can do is set the column gap. And what this does is it creates a space between the columns, kind of like grid gap did when we were doing grid. We have grid column gap and grid row gap and grid gap. So we can set the column gap, and the default is normal, whatever that is, but we can set this to a number, for example, 30 pixels, and that made it a little bit wider. Okay, if I made that, really wide, like 70 pixels, you can see now the gap between my columns is even wider. That's too wide, so we'll go back to 30, which is kind of a nice gap there. Okay. Now another feature we can do is we can put a line down between our columns. You don't see this in newspapers, but sometimes you do in magazines, and I'm not sure why. I guess it's just a style choice. In newspapers, it would just be too cluttered. But we can do a column rule. Now, this is not rule like a CSS rule or a rule that tells you what to do. This is a rule in typography or in typesetting, in printing. A line is called a rule. So do you remember the element we had early on, a horizontal rule, HR, which puts a line across? That's a rule, right? So that's a horizontal rule, the HR element. In this case, we're going to create a vertical rule between columns. And it takes the same properties that a border would take. Okay, so think of it like a border, but it's in the middle. So it's not a border because it's right in the middle of the element. It's not bordering the element, it's right in the middle of the element. So they call it a column rule because it goes between columns. And so we can use the same properties. So in this case, the author asks us to do a 2-pixel solid gray rule. And now you can see there's a rule there. Right? And as you scroll down, you'll see it goes the whole length of the page. Now, if I go back and change this back to column width instead of column count, and I make this wider, you'll see that now when I have 3 columns, the rule goes between each of the columns, right? So that one column rule property sets the rule between all the columns in that article element. So we don't have to set each of those rules, those column rules independently. And then when we go down to no columns, right, it's narrow, so narrow, we don't have any rules. The rules are just between columns. If we wanted rules on the outside, we'd put borders on, okay? So that's column rules. So these are all pretty impressive, right? Like this is pretty neat stuff, but on the web, it's just not that useful. I don't want to read a skinny little column all the way down to the bottom and then go back up to the top and keep going. Okay, that's just kind of crazy. Okay, now wait, there's more. This is like an infomercial. There's more. There's a couple more properties that we have for columns, and there's two actually that kind of go together. They're called widows and orphans, and in typography, widows and orphans are when you have like one line, and I'm just trying to do it. I guess the width, yeah, I'm trying to make it the right width to get a widow or an orphan. But anyway, what a widow and orphan is a widow is when at the bottom of a column you just have one line in a paragraph, and the rest of the paragraph got wrapped to the next line. Okay, and orphans are the opposite, unless I have it backwards. Orphans are one line that wraps to the next column, but the rest of the paragraph was at the bottom of the last column. In print, they avoid this because it's kind of ugly and confusing while you're reading to go to the beginning of a next column. Like, can you imagine turning the page and there's only one word in the paragraph, right? So they avoid that. And so good desktop publishing programs will automatically do this for you. They'll have presets that will automatically do widow and orphan control. But in CSS, we have to specifically apply it. And I don't think the author actually tells us to apply it, but in one of the assignments, oh, he does, yeah, in the article. So in here, what you can do is you can say widows, and tell it the minimum number of rows you want left at the end of a column. And so we'll say 3. So if there's less than 3 lines left at the bottom of a column, it'll pull the whole thing up to the next column. So we'll just have a little extra empty gap there instead of just 1 line left, or even 2. So by setting it to 3, it means we want at least 3 rows or lines in a paragraph before we'll go to the next page, or column rather, and then we can do the same thing for orphans, and say 3 for that as well. 3 is kind of a good number. So here you can see in the second column we have 3 lines, right? Just by default, that's just how it happened. So our widows and orphans aren't really doing anything in this case, but it would prevent less than 3 lines. Okay, so it's not a bad idea to put those in if you use columns, just to avoid those little 1 or 2 line fragments. Okay, 1 line is really problematic, so even setting this to 2 would be an improvement, but 3 is kind of nice. So if at the bottom of this column, I don't know if I can make this happen. I was trying before, and actually right there. Yeah, see how we have 3 lines there? If I turn these off, that might cause those to... No, it's not changing it. Darn it. Okay, I can't get it to demonstrate, but that's what it does. Controls those lines that are just kind of left hanging. Okay. Oh, and one more thing is, see how this heading for this article is just over the 1 column? Usually in a newspaper, you want the heading to go across all the columns, or in an magazine, newspaper or magazine, you want the heading to go across all the columns. This heading looks kind of crammed up. It's a pretty long heading, of course. So we can span that heading across multiple columns. Okay, so this is kind of cool. Now, what we want to do is apply this to the H1. This is an H1 inside the article. So we need to add another rule and say article space H1. So we're targeting the H1 that's inside of the article. And we can say column span, and it's written right out. CSS is always written right out. Column span. And then the only choice is all or none. None is the default, and all is the other option. So now if I say all, it will span across all the columns. And so if I make this wider, you can see it's still spanning across. If I change this back to column width, so I can get 3 columns, you'll see even when it goes to 3 columns, it's still spanning across all 3 columns. Okay, now it kind of makes sense. I had to actually go and double check because I thought, well, why can't you span 2 columns? But you can't. You can only do all or none. And that really makes sense because to span 2 columns would really be awkward because you want to span all of them or none, really. And so that's the only choice they give you. I'm kind of surprised they don't give you more options. But that's it, just all or nothing. Okay, so that's columns, which is totally separate from tables, but you can see why it was kind of put in here because tables was a fairly short topic and columns is even shorter. And so it just kind of made sense to kind of combine it into this chapter, even though the 2 are completely unrelated. Okay, there's nothing really in common between them at all. Okay, so that's it. That's all of, that's all of tutorial 6. So that's it for this chapter. So you're now prepared to go ahead and do the case problems. Even case 1 had some columns, some call groups or row groups and column groups in it. So you wouldn't really be ready to start the assignments until now. So you can go ahead and do both assignments. We've covered everything. For case 2, or for the second assignment, 4B, make sure that you follow my PDF instructions, not the instructions in the book. Okay, it'll be a much shorter assignment for you. So you want to do that. And if you want to do the other in the book, please do it on your own. Don't submit it to me, okay, because it makes it harder for me to mark if you submit the whole thing. I may actually take marks off for that because it's just not the assignment that I'm giving you. So please follow the PDF instructions that I provided with the files. Okay, are there any questions before I shut the recording off? Okay, so I'll stop the recording. So for those watching the recording, this is it for module 4. So next week we will have Q&A sessions instead of, we won't be covering new material next week. Okay, so I'll see you next time. Okay, so I've stopped recording. If anyone has any last questions you want to ask, that's it for today's lecture. Again, we're done a little bit early. This module is actually pretty short, but make sure you take your time with it, and you will find the assignments are time consuming, even though it's not complicated, because there's so much markup with tables and putting all the content in. Even copying and pasting, the author gives you the text to copy and paste. Even that, sometimes it's easier to type it than to copy and paste it. So it's a bit tedious doing the markup for these assignments. So give yourself some time to do that. But it is good practice with these. Tables especially are very important, even though we don't use them a lot. They're very important. The columns, less, like I said, I don't think I've ever used them, but they are kind of a neat feature that you can maybe put in a part of a page. The one case where the author has you use it does look pretty good using it on that page. Just going to take a quick look. Yeah, it's the second one. The second one, he uses some columns in the text above the table, and it looks good there because it's not as huge as this article, so it makes a little more sense to do it. Okay, so if there's no questions, have a great day, and as always, message me anytime on Teams, private message, private chat, if you have any questions about things. And next class on Monday, I will be there. It'll be a kind of a Q&A session. I'll probably just review tables a little bit because I know people often don't have questions. So I'll do a quick review of tables. And on Thursday, I'll do a quick review of columns just to kind of get things started. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them then, or of course, contact me anytime. Okay. So have a great rest of the week. See you Monday.